Hi everyone, today we're going to talk about different types of metaphors that will come up in our reading and possibly even our writing this year throughout AP Literature. In today's lesson, we're going to just briefly touch on what is a metaphor. We'll go over some different types of metaphors, and for each one we'll give a definition as well as some examples. And then at the end we'll talk about analogies, which are somewhat similar, so you might find them grouped, but they're just different enough that they get their own category. So let's start off with something that I'm sure we feel familiar with by now, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. What is a metaphor? It's a comparison between two unlike things that does not use like or as. And it's a type of figurative language. And although all metaphors meet these characteristics, so these first two, there are some that have different qualities as well, which is why today we're going to break it up into different categories. The first one of those will be an implied metaphor. An implied metaphor is a metaphor that does not explicitly state the two things being compared. So for example, if you say she lured him into her web, that's an implied metaphor because it doesn't directly compare her to a spider, but the use of the word web suggests that she's being compared to a spider. It evokes that imagery that makes you assume that that's the comparison. Similarly, another example you might put is if you say his comments slashed his spirits. So again, we aren't getting any direct comparison, but here the comments are indirectly compared to a knife by the use of the word slashed. So when we have that word choice here with web and here with slashed, it's very intentional, and it is meant to evoke this image that makes you, whether or not you realize, it makes you draw that connection, so that is an implied metaphor. Our next type is an extended metaphor, which is sometimes also called a conceit. And these are metaphors that continue notably longer than just a single phrase. They are at least one full sentence long and typically less than a paragraph. So they go on past just one single phrase. If they are one sentence long, it means that it's repeated more than once in the sentence, which is somewhat rare. You usually see it repeated multiple times. So for example, from Romeo and Juliet, we have this little monologue from Romeo where he says, "But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon, who is already sick and pale with grief." So here we have 4 lines, all of which are comparing Juliet to the sun, and they continue throughout Romeo's speech here. If it was just one line, that would just be a regular metaphor, but the fact that he continues several times makes it an extended metaphor. You could also call it a conceit. Next, we have a dead metaphor, which is one that has been used so often that it no longer really makes any striking images. We also call this a cliché. So if you know that word, this is just another term for the same thing. And these are metaphors that you've heard so often that you probably don't even realize that they are metaphors anymore. For example, the head of the household hit the nail on the head, the presentation was crystal clear. These are all things that you hear so often, and in this case you're, comparing the presentation to a piece of crystal, or comparing the precision of the way that you explain something with the precision of hitting a nail perfectly with a hammer. So these are all dead metaphors because we hear them so often that they don't really make you stop anymore. These would not be very effective for your writing. Next, we have a mixed metaphor. This is a metaphor that uses more than one different comparison. And I know that sometimes we might be tempted to think that if one metaphor is good in writing, more than one metaphor is even better, but that's not really the case. Mixed metaphors are not really good. They can make your writing sound confused or clunky, kind of like you don't have one clear vision. So a couple examples, not to pick on anyone, but here are some examples from newspaper writing. So if you say, "So now what we are dealing with is the rubber meeting the road, and instead of biting the bullet on these issues, we just want to punt." So here we have 3 separate metaphors that are underlined: rubber meeting the road, biting the bullet, and punt. And even if you're not necessarily completely apt on being able to identify each of these metaphors, you can still get a sense that this kind of runs on a little bit longer than it possibly needs to in this sentence. So here with the 3 different metaphors, it doesn't really create a clear image, and it kind of makes it sound like you're just pulling from stock wording. Rather than coming up with your own way of explaining something, you're kind of pulling from all these other dead metaphors. Another example could be this one from the New York Times, where it said, "Top Bush hands are starting to get sweaty about where they left their fingerprints. Scapegoating the rotten apples at the bottom of the military's barrel may not be a slam dunk escape route from accountability anymore." So here we have the metaphor of the rotten apple compared to these people Bottom of the barrel, that's another common metaphor. And then the idea of the slam dunk is also a metaphor for success on the first try. So again, we have another excerpt where the excessive use of metaphors makes it sound less focused and less clear, and it also just makes the writing sound very unoriginal. So although most metaphors are a good thing, make sure that you're sticking to kind of one central idea. And then lastly, we have something that falls somewhat in the same category as metaphors, but we'll talk about the differences. An analogy is a comparison made between two things that seem different, but you're using that comparison to show that they're actually alike. It is directly stated, so it should be very clear, and unlike a metaphor, that directly stated means that you'll usually see the word like or as. But these are not figurative language. We use metaphors to paint a picture or to kind of explain the feeling of something in a way that's more eloquent than just directly stating it. But with analogies, it's more of a logical construction in order to make a clear argument. So some examples. Again, going back to Romeo and Juliet, if you say what's in a name, that which we call a rose by any other word would smell as sweet. So Romeo would were he not Romeo called. Here we have an analogy that Juliet makes comparing names and flower names to prove the point that the name itself doesn't change the appeal of the object to which it refers. So here we have an analogy between two things, and it is made not necessarily to compare Romeo to a rose or to use the imagery of the flower, but it's just kind of practical. You know, she's in a garden thinking, and so she uses that to prove her point that his name, or in this case his family's name, shouldn't really have an impact on their relationship. Another example of an analogy, somewhat more straightforward than the Romeo and Juliet one, is this explanation: the structure of an atom is like a solar system, nucleus is the sun, and electrons are the planets revolving around their sun. So in this case, this would be an analogy because it is comparing the structure of an atom to the structure of the solar system. And we see that here it employs a simile in order to use the analogy, but the bigger point is explained in the second sentence where it continues to build on the first one. So this is an analogy. We won't see these as often on the AP exam because since it's AP literature, they're more likely to ask you to discuss metaphors, which are figurative language, as opposed to analogies, which are more just constructions for arguments. But it's important to know the difference so that we don't misidentify anything. And that's it for this lesson. Please feel free to rewind and pause as much as you need to capture this all in your notes so that we are ready to discuss together.